The Hobbit is one of the most beloved epic fantasy novels ever written. J.R.R. Tolkien gifted the world with one of the most cherished fictional universes of all time, which all started with this book, and it would be further built upon later when it came to the movies. Now, while the Lord of the Rings trilogy of the early 2000s is rightfully considered to be one of the greatest trilogies of all time, the same can't be said about its prequel trilogy, The Hobbit. Unfortunately, those films weren't really helped when behind-the-scenes production on them was anything but easy, with an entirely different version of the movie being initially planned and later scrapped, which actually would have been directed by Guillermo Del Toro, the king of cancelled movies. So what if it had happened? What if somehow production had actually gone more to plan, and The Hobbit as we know it was entirely different? Simply put, what if Guillermo Del Toro directed The Hobbit? In late 1999, New Line Cinema hired Peter Jackson to direct what would end up becoming one of the most riskiest movie productions ever. There was absolutely no guarantee that Lord of the Rings would even pay off in the long run, and a considerable amount of money was spent to film the entire trilogy back to back. And needless to say that it did pay off, and New Line were very interested in continuing the saga, with the actual first book in Middle-earth, The Hobbit, as the next film. However, Peter Jackson wasn't actually interested in directing. He didn't think it would be right to make more Middle-earth movies after Lord of the Rings, because then he would feel pressured to top himself. However, he still absolutely loved the franchise, and after finishing production on The Lovely Bones, agreed to return as a writer and producer, but just not as a director. As for who would direct, Jackson ultimately went with his friend Guillermo Del Toro, and similarly to him, he was also a fan of Tolkien's work. Now, he admittedly didn't enjoy reading the books themselves that much because, well, he found them a little hard to follow, which is understandable, but he did enjoy the world and the characters, and that's really the important thing. So Del Toro decided to scrap all of his plans that he had going on at the time and focus 100% on directing The Hobbit. Now, Del Toro also would have worked as a co-writer, alongside Philippa Boyens and Fran Walsh, who'd previously worked on the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Now for the cast, Del Toro had some ideas for certain characters, but a full cast was far from solidified, so take this with a grain of salt. He was said to have envisioned Brian Blessed as Thorin Oakenshield, Ron Perlman as either Smaug or Beorn, Doug Jones as Thranduil or the Goblin King, Ian McShane as Balin, and as far as the lead character goes, he apparently was championing Ian Holm to play Bilbo throughout the entirety of the films rather than just as the narrator. So now the plan actually wasn't even to make it a trilogy, but instead just a duology. The plan was to just do 2 movies, and basically the idea was the first Hobbit was going to be more or less a direct adaptation of the original book, which would see Bilbo Baggins, Gandalf, and the dwarfs going off on their journey to the Lonely Mountain to reclaim Erebor from Smaug the Dragon. We would start with a very innocent Bilbo, who doesn't really know how things in the world really are, and we basically see him get hardened to the world as the movie goes on. He wanted to draw comparisons to World War I, actually, since the author J.R.R. Tolkien actually was a World War I veteran. And during that war, a lot of people went into it with a romanticized idea of what war was like, but they just became so hardened to reality when they entered the trenches. Now, something interesting to note as well is that Tolkien hated romantic depictions of war, which is why in the Hobbit book we actually learn about the events of the battle after it happens through speech instead of actually being shown it. Like in the story, Bilbo gets knocked unconscious right before the battle, and then that's it. And apparently Del Toro planned to do the battle this way too, telling not showing, which might have been controversial, but you really can't blame Del Toro for wanting to stay true to the book. So yeah, in this version, Bilbo would have been knocked unconscious at the start of the battle, and he would later wake up and be told about it by other characters. He wanted to stay true to Tolkien's spirit. Now, Del Toro was actually known to use war as a tragic storytelling device in movies like Pan's Labyrinth, and he actually shared Tolkien's opinion that children should not be raised to think war is a grandiose or even good thing. And also along the way in the story, Bilbo would have obtained the One Ring from Gollum, and this would set us up for The Hobbit 2, which would bridge the gap between Hobbit 1 and Fellowship of the Ring. It would show Bilbo slowly becoming more and more corrupted by the ring, and actually show him raising Frodo, possibly. And we would also see a lot of Gandalf and explore the White Council and Dol Guldur. So yeah, those storylines were still going to happen, but they were going to happen in a different movie than The Hobbit, so that would have helped to not dog down the pacing. I think we can all agree with that. Now, Del Toro said that he planned on having the first movie be very light in tone and be aesthetically very different from Lord of the Rings. He wanted to capture his own version of Middle-earth that was different from Jackson's, one that resembled a proper fairy tale, that you wouldn't wouldn't know was about to be corrupted just because of how, warm and inviting it looks now. He wanted to capture that calm before the storm. However, the second movie would see the lightness of the first film give way to a slow-burning darkness that grows not just with the tone and the characters, but also with the visual style, as we would see the aesthetic slowly become more and more like Jackson's from Lord of the Rings, more darker and grittier. And one thing I should touch on as well is that Del Toro actually didn't want to rely too much on CGI, and he envisioned some of the characters being animatronics instead, including possibly Smaug and Azog the Defiler. So now, unfortunately, plans were changing a lot behind the scenes, with script revisions apparently being extremely commonplace. Filming was initially hoped to start in 2010, but this was delayed since they didn't even have a cast lined up. Now, this was on top of parent company MGM going through some very well-documented financial troubles, and despite this, Del Toro remained ever optimistic that the movie would still get made, and said that they were prepared for whatever changes came their way. Sadly, though, Del Toro would soon realize that he might have spoken too soon. When it became clear that the movies would take much longer to make than expected, with several years needing to be cleared, Del Toro ultimately decided to back out as director. He would say that he harbored no ill feelings towards MGM or New Line, and that he fully supported whoever they chose to be director in his place. In the end, they went with Peter Jackson, who very reluctantly agreed to direct what would end up becoming a trilogy. Del Toro would not remain involved at all, but he did receive the screenwriter credit on the first movie nonetheless. He was apparently heartbroken at leaving, and said it was very, very hard for him to do, but thought it was ultimately for the best. And so that is what Guillermo Del Toro's Hobbit would have been like. So what do I think of it? Well, before I get into that, there's something else I need to get off my chest, which is that I don't think Peter Jackson's Hobbit movies are that bad. Honestly, I think that they get way too much hate. There are issues with it, I do admit. There's a bit of a tone clash. They never know if they want it to be gritty like Lord of the Rings or lighthearted like the book, and it's also not very well paced. You can definitely tell they were grasping at straws to find a way to, extend the plot out so they can make it a trilogy. Because the Hobbit book isn't even that long, Like, when J.R.R. Tolkien wrote it, he wrote it before Lord of the Rings. He wrote it before he really fleshed this world out to, like, the grandiose levels that we'd see in Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. So, it's hard to stretch The Hobbit out to be like an epic trilogy like Lord of the Rings when it was never really meant to be that. So we ended up getting all these subplots we weren't supposed to get that really dogged down the pacing. And Del Toro, he was going to do away with that. All this stuff that was bogging down the pacing wouldn't have been in it, and all that stuff would have been saved for the sequel. And the sequel, we would have known going in, was supposed to be the one to bridge Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And I think that would have been better, because that way you could focus on the darker stuff at Dol Guldur and the stuff with, the necromancer who turns out to be Sauron. You could spend a whole movie focusing on that stuff. That wouldn't have to share the screen with the stuff with, Thorin and Gandalf and Bilbo. Or not Gandalf. You get what I mean. And Del Toro wasn't going to do that. He was going to save all that for the second movie, which I think would have been much better, ultimately. And I really like his ideas. I love the idea of the first one being really lighthearted, and then the second one being the one to sort of bridge that. Like, still having some of the lightness, but, like, slowly kind of seeing the dark coming through. I like that idea a lot, because there is a huge tone difference between Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and it would be interesting to see a movie explore that change, like exactly where that change would happen. And honestly, Del Toro would be great at it. I don't think he gets enough credit for his lighthearted stuff. Like, he does a lot of dark stuff, but I think his lighthearted stuff is really good too. So I honestly think that he would be a perfect fit for The Hobbit, especially if they wanted to go for a more Lord of the Rings tone. Like, if they shot down his fairy tale tone and wanted it to be more like Lord of the Rings, he would still be perfect for the job, honestly. But yeah, ultimately, also 3 movies, that was excessive. I think 2 movies is definitely more reasonable, and the fact that only the first movie would be a direct adaptation sounds even better, because then you could cut out all the crap we don't need to see, because there's a lot of crap we don't need to see in those movies, honestly. So ultimately, I do think that his Hobbit would be a lot breezier than the trilogy we got. It would probably be a lot more fun, too. Like, it would be more lighthearted all the way through and not, be too dark. Because he's actually said he was not going to treat the ring like a big deal. Because in The Hobbit, it's not treated like a big deal. J.R.R. Tolkien, when he wrote the Riddles in the Dark scene, he didn't plan for the ring to be important later. He only intended the ring to be a trickster ring, like something something, you know, fun, you know, something that would turn people invisible, and that's it. And that's what Del Toro wanted. He didn't want to make The Ring a big deal yet. He wanted The Ring to become a big deal in The Hobbit 2, you know, leading into Lord of the Rings, where it becomes the biggest thing in the world, you know? So I think that would have been really cool to see, you know, a Hobbit that doesn't rely so goddamn much on Lord of the Rings familiarity. I think that would have been really fun. As far as his casting choices go, they're really good, in my opinion. Some people might roll their eyes at some of his, you know, familiar names being thrown in there, like Ron Perlman and Doug Jones. But I mean, think about it. Ron Perlman, he's got the fucking physique and the gruffness to play Beorn. He would definitely be a great Beorn. Or if they wanted to go with Smaug, he'd be a great Smaug too. He's got, you know, a very gruff, distinctive voice that I think would work really well with a dragon, honestly. I mean, just watch him in the Hellboy movies and just tell me you can't imagine that guy, you know, voicing a dragon. Like, honestly, he's got a dragon voice. He really does. So yeah, I think Ron Perlman in either of those roles would have been great. And Doug Jones as Thranduil, perfect, honestly. Like, have you seen Doug Jones? His face looks exactly like Lee Pace's almost. Like, they've got the same kind of hollowed out features. He would be perfect looking as Thranduil. And as for the Goblin King, I think the idea to make the Goblin King all CGI was a mistake in the final movie, and I think it was a bit distracting. Like, the CGI wasn't very good on him at all, and I think that making him like a guy with makeup would have looked a lot better. And Doug Jones, you know, he's skinny, I know, but, like, that guy transforms. Like, that guy can do anything you want him to do. You put him in any suit, he'll make it his own. He is an absolute master of just being a chameleon, honestly. So whether it was Thranduil or the Goblin King, he would have been absolutely perfect. Brian Blessed is Thorin. Some people are going to say, because Brian Blessed's a bit on the older side, but Thorin's not supposed to be that young. They changed that for the movie. He's actually supposed to be fairly old in the book, and therefore I think Brian Blessed would have been good. It's a little hard to imagine him as the warrior type, I admit, but man, I honestly do think he would make a good Thorin. Like, somebody who's battle-hardened and would have good stories to tell. He would have, like, the storyteller voice, but also, like, the voice that you could imagine commanding people. Brian Blessed, I just think would be a great fit for the Thorin character. And we have Ian Holm as Bilbo. Apparently that wouldn't have happened, though, because they tried to stick with that idea. They tried to stick with the idea of Ian Holm as Bilbo in the actual movie, even after Del Toro left. And he said no because he felt like he was too old for the fight scenes, which, yeah, that's fair enough. So I do think that they still have gone with Martin Freeman, and obviously Martin Freeman was great as Bilbo, like, perfect casting, honestly. So yeah, I think that would have been great. Whether Ian Holm changed his mind if Del Toro was around, which he wouldn't have done, or if Martin Freeman stayed on, which he would have done, then I think Del Toro would have worked great with either of them, honestly. And do I even need to mention Ian McShane as Balin? Like, dude, that's perfect. Like, he would be absolutely perfect, honestly, as Balin, in my opinion. Honestly, I think an actor of his caliber not being in Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit's kind of strange. Like, I feel like he definitely should have been in one of those, and I think that him, you know, playing Balin would have been great. Honestly, I really do. He's a man of many talents. I think he could really pull that off. And I also just love the idea of these parallels being drawn to World War I. You know, this, like, optimistic, you know, sort of Bilbo going off on this journey and coming back, you know, a changed man. I just love that idea. I love the parallels between this and World War I he was going to do. I think that would have been brilliant, especially since, as I said, Tolkien was a World War I veteran, so it would have been, you know, perfect as a legacy thing in that regard, if that makes any sense. And as for the visual effects, like, do I even need to say it? Del Toro, man, that guy is so good at the visuals, man. Like, even when he works with CGI, he's great. Just look at Pacific Rim. That movie looks fantastic, and that's mostly CGI. But when he does his practical effects, man, that's, like, next-level stuff. Like, seriously, any Guillermo Del Toro movie is going to be visually stunning, at the very least. Like, honestly, I like all of his movies, but even if you don't like his movies, you have to admit his movies look good. Like, seriously, that fish man in Shape of Water is real. Like, that's Doug Jones in a suit with makeup. That's not even CGI. And it looks so good, doesn't it? Like, just imagine what you could do with Lord of the Rings, or, I'm sorry, The Hobbit. Like, just imagine some of the designs he could have. Like, he had concept art going for Smaug and, you know, and for the wolves, you know? I think, and after looking at that concept art, I have to say, it looks really, really cool. And, yeah, honestly, like, he could make anything work, really. This man has a Midas touch. He really, really does. And considering it has the same makeup and costume people on board from Lord of the Rings, and they did so good with Lord of the Rings, like, there's no doubt at all. And, you know, if they did use CGI at all, I think it would have looked better in this version, because, I mean, think about it. The reason the CGI looks bad in the actual movies is because, you know, they were rushed. Peter Jackson, he didn't have enough time. Because basically, when Del Toro left in 2010, they didn't give Jackson extra time to make it his own, because he decided that he wasn't going to direct Del Toro's version, because he reasoned, you know, that if Del Toro was gone, they shouldn't try to direct his stuff. The only person who can direct the Del Toro movie is Guillermo Del Toro. So he wanted to make it his own, and then, you know, they told him, oh, no, you got to keep going off of this. We're not going to give you extra time. And it really suffered because of it. And, you know, Peter Jackson admits that he's, you know, sad with the final result. He's not happy with the final result of the Hobbit trilogy. And ultimately, I think if Del Toro had stuck around, then, well, he would have been making it at his own pace. And because he would have started, you know, before Jackson did in the Ultimate version. So, you know, I think the Hobbit movies ultimately would have been a lot more solid with Del Toro as director. And now, I'm sure that there's some things that people are going to not like the decision to not do the Battle of the Five Armies at all, and have Bilbo get knocked out. I'm sure some people might see that as cheap, and I understand why, if anyone think that's cheap. I don't think it is. I think that it would stay true to the spirit of the book, and it would make the movie, you know, be light, you know, because this is supposed to be the calm before the storm. This is supposed to be the happy story before Lord of the Rings, which is very much not that, you know, like when Frodo talks about, you know, how he always imagined himself going off with Bilbo on one of his adventures, but his own adventure turned out to be a lot different. That's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a huge tone shift, you know, between the lightness of The Hobbit and then the darkness of Lord of the Rings. So I like the idea of that staying true, of The Hobbit being noticeably different in tone from Lord of the Rings, and then having like this middle movie to bridge it. I think that would be amazing. It really, really would. So ultimately, in my opinion, I think Guillermo del Toro's The Hobbit is one of the biggest missed opportunities in Hollywood history. I'm not even joking. Like, The Hobbit's hype was through the roof. Like, it can't be denied how many people were excited about these movies. And, like, as I said, I like the final result. I don't think that it's that bad, but it's not as good as Lord of the Rings. It's not. I mean, Peter Jackson, he had the right idea when he said he didn't want to direct it because he was worried about, you know, trying too hard to top himself. I honestly think The Hobbit needed someone new in the director's chair. And I can't think of anyone better than Del Toro. I really can't. And, you know, Jackson would have been there as well, you know, in a more hands-off role, so he wouldn't have, you know, been getting 2 hours of sleep every night like he did with the actual movie. And he probably would have been a lot better off as well. So ultimately, I think everybody would have been better off if this movie had been made, or these movies had been made. That's just my opinion. As I said, I love the Peter Jackson Hobbit movies. I have a real soft spot for them, especially because I saw The Hobbit first. Like, yeah, believe it or not, I actually saw the first Hobbit movie before I saw the Lord of the Rings movies. So I have a real soft spot for the Hobbit movies, honestly. So yeah, you know, even though I don't hate those movies, I think these ones would have been a huge improvement. But anyway, guys, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Would you have rather see Guillermo del Toro direct The Hobbit, or are you fine with the Peter Jackson ones? I'd love to hear your opinions. Also, give me more what-if recommendations in the comments down below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up, and share it with all of your friends and all your various social media platforms, and I'll see all you guys in the next video.